Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashim Yahweh Shai, Ba'ashim Rakakwadash, double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai, back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to read through this story of our forefather Jacob, and just going through some of the things that he went through in regards to Laban, caring for the flocks, and dealing and looking into a lot of his affliction, but looking also at his element or his sentiment of uprightness, the way he conducted himself, his integrity, right, and just the way he essentially behaved, right, despite the fact that he was being afflicted, right, because we can always pull together certain tenets, certain fruits of the spirit for the way our forefathers conducted themselves, even in the midst of whether they were sovereign or whether they were in captivity, right? Because the scriptures talk about how the things that were written aforetime were written for our learning, right? So I want to jump around in this chapter here in Genesis, the 31st chapter, and the title here, it says Jacob leaves secretly for Canaan, right? And here it says, this is Genesis chapter 31, verse 1. And it says, and he heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was our father's hath he gotten all his glory. This glory, And it says, and Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. And the Lord said unto Jacob, return unto thy land of thy fathers, and to thy kindred I will be with thee. And Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field unto his flock, and said unto them, I see your father's countenance, that is not towards me as before, but the Most High of my father hath been with me. And ye know that all with my power I have served thy father, right? So essentially, Isaac gives Jacob a charge, to go, don't go onto the women of, I believe it was the Canaanites, he said not to go onto. So he ends up doing work for Laban, right? And Jacob essentially, he encounters Rachel, and he has a strong feeling and sentiment towards her, and he decides to work a certain amount of time. It was approximately 7 years. In his first 7 years he acquired Leah, right, and then eventually he decides to work another 7 years for Rachel, right? So at this point he is more established, he is more he's very profitable. That's another thing also I wanted to we can take out from this story as well, right? But also is really just mostly focusing on his affliction of what he suffered from, but understanding he had an element of integrity, that he conducted himself despite the fact that he was being afflicted, right? This is verse 7, and it says, and your father hath deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but the Most High, Yahweh Ba'ashim Shai, suffered him to not hurt me. If I said it thus, the speckled shall be thy wages, then all the cattle bear speckled. And if he said thus, the ringstraked shall be thy hire, then bear all the cattle ringstraked. Thus the Most High hath taken away the cattle of your father and given them to me. But it came to pass that the cattle conceived, and I lifted up my eyes, and I saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the cattle were ringstraked, speckled, and gristled, right? And the angel of the Most High spake unto me, and in a dream, saying, Jacob. And I said, Here I am. And he said, Now lift up thine eyes, and see all the rams which leap upon the cattle are ringstraked, speckled, and I have seen Laban, all that Laban doeth unto thee. So essentially, this was supposed to be a certain amount of payment, where Laban was supposed to pay certain kinds of cattle towards Jacob. So essentially, he's trying to cheat him and change his wages, right? Because the scriptures talk about how the bread of the needy is their life, right? So this is, you have a servant, you want to make sure that they're taken care of, but Laban wasn't actually issuing that proper payment towards Jacob, right? Kept changing the wages, right? So I want to jump down actually to verse 37, right? To kind of go into a little bit more of his affliction, where he was where he shares some of the things that he experienced, right? So this is verse 37 here, and it says, so at this point, Laban pursues after Jacob, right? And without actually letting him, know that he was leaving, right? So it says, verse 37, it says, whereas thou search all my stuff and hast found all thy household stuff and set it before my brethren and thy brethren, that they may judge betwixt us both. This 20 years that I have been with thee, thy ewes and thy she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of thy flock I have not eaten. So he's explaining, this is the way I conducted myself, I should say, while I was actually working for you, right? And it says here, verse 39, and that which was torn of beasts I brought not unto thee, I bear the loss of it. Of my hand thou didst require it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. Thus I was in the day, the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. I want to get that actually in the AMP. I just want to read, so it kind of just gets more of an understanding of what Jacob was going through in the midst of working for Laban, right? Let me go here. Because essentially Jacob is suffering. He's going through his moment of suffering, and we know the scriptures go into, especially Peter, as it goes into two kinds of suffering. So you have that suffering that is not essentially as someone who is an evildoer, as someone who is a thief, or someone who's a murderer, or someone who's someone who's like who causes strife and causes problems, right? Causes discord and so on and so forth. That's one type of suffering. And then you have the kind of suffering where is, you essentially bear the Lord's indignation, right? Whereas you're being tried in a position where you have to, it's mostly to test your integrity, because you might have the opportunity to do and get your lick back and get essentially cause harm to another person without actually becoming carnal, right? Because Satan is always in the midst, as it says in Peter's. Satan is always in the midst, looking to see who he may devour, right? There's always an opportunity, and Satan's always lurking about, going back and forth, right? So this is really just to kind of explain and go and show, Jacob's uprightness still in the midst of, this relationship here. And you can look at this situation and look at it from the perspective of yourself and looking at it as someone who you might work with, or it can also be someone who's like a family member also, right? Having that, having that type of relationship, to uphold a sentiment of integrity, it can be very, very challenging, because there's emotions tied to it. It's not just somebody who is like a regular Joe Schmo on the street, but at the same time, you want to maintain your uprightness and your integrity, so you essentially become blameless. You're not somebody who is suffering, like I said before, as someone who's an evildoer, right? As a matter of fact, since I mentioned that, let me just grab that. This is First Peter chapter 4, verse 15, and it says, "And let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters," right? And it says here, if any man suffer, if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, right? So Christian is not essentially a nationality, just for context and explanation, right? The Israelites were first called Christians in Antioch, right? So it's not a nationality like a lot of our people, would normally think, right? Just to bring some clarification to what that says here. And it says, "But let him glorify the Most High on his behalf," right? So let me go back here to the story in the AMP. I'm just going to read just to get more of an understanding of his affliction and what he went through, right? Here it says, I'll read verse 38 in the AMP. And it says, "These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not lost their young, nor have I eaten the rams of your flocks. I did not bring you the torn carcasses of your animals attacked by predators. I personally took the loss. You required of me to make good everything that was stolen, whether it occurred by day or night. This was my situation. By the day the heat consumed me, by the night the cold, I could not sleep," right? So, it's just to paint a picture of Jacob's affliction here, because remember, this is the ancient times, right? So, we didn't have, the shepherds, people who were like, I'm going to say shepherds, I mean like actual shepherds, people who are watching over sheep and flocks. Sheep are very simple, right? So, the point is, a shepherd was somebody, they were the type of person who had to be and have to have a certain level of diligence. They had to be very, very circumspect. So you had to constantly be walking around, looking around, caring for the welfare of your sheep and making sure they eat. You want to make sure that they're guarded safely. You want to make sure that they eat the right thing. They have to make sure, because in that kind of situation, you also have to be mindful of predators. You also have to look out to see, if there's any wolves and they're lurking nearby. Are there any foxes? Are there any threats? Are there any or another threat can be another person, right? So it wasn't the type of job that was it's not like a cushiony, in your office with the AC and you kick your legs up and stuff like that. It's a very laborious job, right? So a lot of the times what Jacob is describing here, he's describing his affliction and showing and painting a picture of like what he was going through in the moment, performing a duty of a shepherd, right? Because he's caring for another person's flocks, right? So I read verse 40 in here, and it says in the AMP, this was my situation. By day the heat consumed me, and by night the cold, and I could not sleep, right? So because he still has to be vigilant, but he's still watching for predators, making sure the welfare of the sheep are taken care of, making sure that making sure they're well fed, right? So it's not like a duty where you can kind of sleep and then wake up and so on and so forth. There had to be a level of he had to possess a certain level of mental alertness to make sure that the welfare is being done, that his position is being done properly, right? Verse 41, and it says, "In these 20 years I have been in your house. I have served 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for my share of your flocks, and you have changed my wages 10 times. And if the Most High of my father, the God of Abraham and of Isaac, had not been with me, most certainly you would have sent me away empty-handed. The Most High Yahweh Bashim Shai has seen my affliction and my humiliation and humiliation, and the exhausting labor of my hands. So he rendered judgment and rebuked you last night, right? Because I'm pretty sure there was a portion where he had essentially a dream, right, where it essentially shook him up, right? Because this was part of Jacob's affliction, but that doesn't justify what Laban was doing unto Jacob, because remember the scriptures talk about how the bread of the needy is their life, right? So when somebody works for you, you're supposed to pay them, according to our laws. You're supposed to make sure they're paid that's within that same day. You're not supposed to kind of basically, like the way it's set up in this society, for example, you work 5 days, or you might work 2 weeks and you get to that paycheck at the end of 2 weeks or a week, right? Because you don't know what that person needs that money for, right? Because that's in our laws in terms of how to actually pay somebody, right? As a matter of fact, let me see if I can find that. This is Deuteronomy 24, verse 14. And it says, "Thou shalt not oppress an hired servant that is poor and needy, whether he be of thy brethren, of thy strangers that are in the land within thy gates." Right? So you're not supposed to oppress, your own people, right? There's supposed to be a certain way to actually take care of your own kin. And it says here, and his day thou shalt give him his hire, neither shall the sun go down upon it. For he is poor, and he setteth his heart upon it, lest he cry against thee unto the Lord, and it be a sin unto thee, right? So it's just a way to actually care for your own kin, right? And this is something our people have strongly lost because they have taken off the ways of Esau. But nevertheless, this is more about learning about Jacob's story and learning about Jacob's integrity, right? So I wanted to read this, because, Jacob could have easily been, taking that opportunity to get his vengeance upon, Laban, taking it out on his daughters, taking it up on his essentially his future wives. Well, they were married at that time, right? But the point is, Jacob, he didn't get out of his element by behaving very carnal, right? So even in the midst of actually performing a duty for somebody, he still maintained a certain level of integrity. And that is character that has been lost within our people, because our people have Babylon the Great, or Esau, has essentially promoted a culture where if something is done wrong to you, get your lick back, and I mean that in terms of within amongst our own people, and then they're quick to inflict harm upon another. They're quick to off each other, delete each other with Esau's blessing, with Esau's weaponry, right? And our people have lost the importance, or lost the understanding, I should say, of A, suffering, and B, learning to take the low, and actually C, waiting on the Lord to fight for them and get their vengeance, right? We're essentially, wait ye upon me, saith the Lord, right? This is Psalms chapter 26, verse 9. And it says, "Gather not my soul with sinners, nor my life with bloody men, in whose hands is mischief, and in their right hands is full of bribes. But as for me, I will walk in mine integrity. Redeem me and be merciful unto me," right? So it's just essentially a way that, going into these different accounts, how we walk, right? And essentially remaining blameless, right? We're not, the way, essentially, the crash out mentality is the easy way to go. And that is a society that we live in, where that crash out mentality is just a way to operate, rather than actually remaining spiritual in regards to the situations that they're in. And that's another thing. That's why the scriptures say, I think Paul said it, the carnal mind can't receive essentially the things of the spirit, because they're not, they lack that discernment, right? To roughly paraphrase. So essentially, if you operate in a carnal mindset, you're going to do things that are going to be quick to be easy to please the flesh, right? So a good example of that was when King Saul threw javelins at David. That is something that is very carnal, right? But what David didn't do, he didn't operate in the mindset of throwing those javelins back, even though he had opportunities to actually get his vengeance back at his own kin, back at King Saul. He didn't take it, right? Because the scriptures say that his heart smote him, so his conscience essentially kicked in, right? The spirit of the Lord, it essentially it kicked in, so it kind of pulled him back from actually doing something that he would have regrettably done, right? So this is in these situations, it's a test of integrity. It's a test of keeping an upright attitude and remaining blameless, because to fall into that carnal mindset is really just death, and it doesn't actually, and it lacks a sentiment of patience and faith, right? For essentially to wait for the Lord to vindicate you, right? Because with all that being said, because we can easily and probably have been in situations where certain what's it called, family members, or even people that you might have been cool with in the world, they probably did something, you know what I'm saying, right, that were your own people, but you didn't take the opportunity to get your vengeance back, right? So I guess I'll end off with this last one. This is 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 12, and it says, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, and they may see your good works, right? So Jacob had good works. He was somebody, he was honest. He didn't cheat from Laban, even though Laban tried to beguile him. He didn't try to what's the word I'm looking for, try to bring up false accusations. He didn't take out his anger upon his Rachel or Leah, like, you know what I'm saying, like he could have done that, or he could have taken it out on his children, right? He didn't try to do that. He wasn't trying to or he didn't try to get a tit for tat type of spirit. He wasn't in that type of vibe, right? All he did he remained blameless. Even though he was afflicted, he still remained blameless, right? And it says here that you may see your good works, that they may be, behold, glorify the Most High in the day of visitation. So all he had was good receipts, right? So they can't, essentially, Jacob remained blameless, in the midst of this situation here, right? So, because if you think about it also, when Jake gets very carnal, that is an opportunity for the enemy, aka Esau, to become an accuser and say, oh, he did this, he did that, he did this, he did that. You know what I'm saying? As opposed to actually, remaining spiritual, because Esau can't win in the spiritual realm, right? So, I guess I'll leave the lesson there, but I sincerely pray and hope this lesson was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. Until next time, I say Shalom.